Welcome to the video on working with suicidal callers. This is a presentation that I previously gave to the local suicide prevention hotline, but I thought I'd post it online in case it's helpful for others, and also for that hotline to be able to keep using it in the future for trainings. So, the goal for today is to talk a little bit about the epidemiology of suicide, meaning the statistics about suicide, talk about some of information about methods, things like that. We're going to touch on the theoretical basis of suicide. I'm going to touch on two theories of suicide that I think are especially important for crisis hotline workers and volunteers. I'm going to go over a tool that will hopefully help you be able to ask if someone's suicidal and also help you with helping them get help. I'm going to introduce you to an empirically supported risk measure, a risk assessment measure, and then discuss briefly creating a safety plan, knowing that this is something that you won't be able to probably fully do as a hotline worker, but something that you can begin working on and can help then transition the person into clinical care. So starting with epidemiology, there were 38,364 suicides in the United States in 2010. But it's hard to really know how big of a number that is without some frame of reference. So, for instance, with lightning, we take great precautions with lightning because we know it can be deadly, right? And so we'll, postpone soccer games, we'll postpone football games due to lightning, and reasonably so. But with this, if you looked at an average for about 10 years of data, there are about 49 deaths due to lightning in the United States every year. Similarly, we take great precautions to prevent fire deaths. We have people have fire alarms in their house, in every bedroom, and we do fire drills at schools, all good things. And there are about 3,195 fire deaths. Similarly, with drownings, we go to great lengths, and there are about 4,000 drownings. So you can see where I'm going. We take a lot of precautions for many different death or causes of death, even though they're much less common than suicide. Now, I also think it's helpful to have a couple that show the magnitude of suicide, how big this really is, because we don't hear about it much due to the stigma. So, for instance, in 2009, there were 16,799 murders. So there are about twice as many suicides as there are murders in the United States. And lastly, and this is the one that really amazes people, there are more deaths by suicide than automobile accident deaths. So suicide is a really big problem. It's the 10th leading cause of death in the United States, but you don't hear about it much just because there's a stigma about suicide. People don't talk about it, and because of that, people don't think that it's as common as it is. And then in Mississippi, which is where I'm at, suicide is has the 30th highest suicide rate in the United States, with 388 deaths being attributed to suicide in 2010. So one thing that I think is important to talk about are suicide rates in different age groups. Overall, we see that suicide rates are increasing, so that's this bottom line here. Our actual national average, our national rate is increasing over the last several years. And this is actually due to a change that we see with suicide in age. So traditionally, older adults have always had the highest suicide rates. But what we see is that older adult suicide is actually coming down. It's actually the baby boomers that are drastically increasing. And this is in large part what's causing this increase in suicide rates. So all three of these groups are at elevated risk, as you can see. But just looking at the trends, this seems to really be due to the increase in suicide rate among baby boomers. Now, just looking at some age and sex differences, overall there are approximately 25 suicide attempts for every one death. However, this differs widely based upon age. So for younger adults, there are between 100 and 200 suicide attempts for every one death. So younger adult suicide attempts are much less likely to be fatal. However, for older adults, that ratio drops to between 2 and 4 to 1, so a much greater likelihood that a suicide attempt will be fatal for older adults. There are also significant sex differences that are worth mentioning. Specifically, women are 3 times more likely to attempt suicide, but men are 4 times more likely to die by suicide. So why is this? Why are all these, what can we attribute this to? I believe it's a combination of a couple factors, but one of the biggest ones is methods of attempts. So what you'll notice is for women are much less likely to use firearms than men. So that's one piece. But also look at this. For younger individuals are significantly less likely to use firearms than older individuals. So I think a lot of the differences that we saw in the last slide can be attributed to these differences here in methods, suicide attempt methods. So some risk factors, we're just going to touch on some of these. We know that about 90% of those who die by suicide have a psychiatric disorder or meet criteria for a psychiatric disorder. But that doesn't tell the whole story, because while many people who die by suicide do have a psychiatric disorder, we also know that that's only a very small percentage of those with a psychiatric disorder will go on to die by suicide. For instance, it's estimated roughly 1 to 2% of those who are depressed will go on to die by suicide. So I don't want it to seem like a huge proportion of those who have psychiatric disorders go on to die by suicide, but it certainly does increase the risk statistically. We also know that past suicide attempt is a strong predictor of future suicidal behavior, and roughly 20 to 50% of those who die by suicide had a previous attempt. So I mention this for a couple reasons. The primary one is that some will argue that someone isn't at acute suicide risk unless they've attempted before. Well, we know that's not the case because, as you can see from the statistic, a large number of people, a large percentage of people, die by suicide on their first attempt. Second, though, look on the flip side, it is one of the risk factors that we absolutely have to pay attention to because it does significantly increase suicide risk. Other factors that we'll talk about a little bit as we go on are family history of psychiatric disorder or suicide, impulsivity, and also age and sex, as we talked about on the previous slide. So now I want to touch a little bit on 2 suicide theories that I think are very helpful for understanding suicide and understanding how a crisis volunteer, crisis worker can help in preventing suicide. The first is David Rudd's fluid vulnerability model, which postulates that suicide risk is time limited. So it's not something that's going to last for a long time. It's going to be something that may last for hours to days. And it's about surviving the time that someone's at acute suicide risk. So a couple things to know about this model. First, there's baseline risk. So baseline risk varies from individual to individual and is made up of fairly static factors that just in general increase someone's risk of suicide. So this may be having a history of attempts, being depressed, having a family history of suicide, things of that nature. So things that are just going to put you at higher chronic risk, things that are not going to change very quickly. Then there's also acute risk that gets piled on, and that is something that gets elevated by aggravating factors, so stressors. And then after the stressor is resolved, then someone goes back to their acute risk, or they go back to their baseline risk rather, and then the crisis is over. So let's look at what this actually looks like. I think a model is helpful. So here we have 2 people. So we have someone that has a lower baseline risk and a higher baseline risk. So this may be someone who maybe is depressed, has attempted suicide before, or something like that. Now, one question that this model addresses is how can two people experience the same thing, and for one person it leads them to suicide and the other person it does not? Well, here we have two people experiencing the same stressor. And what you see is for the person with lower baseline risk, the stressor doesn't throw them over the threshold into a suicidal state. However, for the person with higher risk, they do go over this threshold because of the acute stressor. Now, once the person gets past this acute phase, once the stressor is relieved, then they go back to their normal baseline risk. So, a large part of the crisis worker's job, the crisis call worker job, is to help someone get through this time, help someone survive this acute risk period in order to get back to baseline when they're again under that suicide threshold. There's also Joyner's interpersonal psychological model of suicide. And this postulates that suicide is determined by three main factors: acquired capability to enact lethal self-harm, perceived burdensomeness, and thwarted belongingness, or lack of belongingness. So, for acquired capability, the best way to introduce this is by asking the question, what do athletes, physicians, prostitutes, and those with anorexia have in common? And the answer is they all have higher suicide rates. So, why might this be? Well, what the model postulates, and one of the things that was truly revolutionary about this model, is that there's this acquired capability that has to be, it's something that must be acquired in order to kill oneself. And so the thought here is it's a fearlessness that must be acquired. It's a habituation to fearsome things or to pain, so that the person no longer fears that, is no longer held back by that. So in doing this, it enables someone to overcome really our greatest human instinct, which is the instinct of self-preservation, through habituating to pain and habituating to fear something so much that it just no longer gets in the way. So this can be done either through your own experience, so through experiencing fearsome things or pain, or vicariously by watching other people experience it. Then burdensomeness and belongingness. So perceived burdensomeness, the key word is perceived. Often people really aren't a significant burden to others, or the thought is that they feel like their death is worth more than their life. And this is virtually never the case, but they feel that way, so that's where perceived comes in. So the person feels like they're a burden on others, or that their death is worth more than their life. And then there's thwarted belongingness, which is really a loneliness. It's isolation. So we see that isolation is one of the strongest risk factors for suicide, so that's also illustrated in this model. So the model graphically looks like this. So you have those who desire suicide, which are people who have this thwarted belongingness, this lack of belongingness, and who experience perceived burdensomeness. Now, what you'll notice is that the vast majority of those who desire suicide are not capable of suicide. So that's why you see so many attempts for every death by suicide. On the flip side, you see that we have those who are capable of overcoming self-preservation and dying by suicide, and thankfully most of these are not suicidal. But there's this group that is capable of suicide and also desires suicide, and that's where you're at risk of serious attempt or death by suicide. So now that we've gone through the model, what are some basic suicide assessments? What do we look for? What are some risk factors to be aware of? So with this, we're going to look at a couple things. We're going to look at what factors influence baseline risk. So that's that static risk we talked about. What factors affect acute risk? So that's more that risk that's affected by stressors. And we'll also discuss a person's surroundings. So where they live, if they live with others, involvement of family and friends, those can also affect suicide risk and affect our judgment of how great of risk someone is. So the first step is asking about suicidal ideation. So often many people have never had to ask someone about suicide, and this can be something that's very feared by many people for many reasons. One is a lot of people believe that this may harm someone. You may give someone the idea that they weren't having before, that I'm going to make someone suicidal by asking about it. Well, this has been shown pretty clearly in the literature not to be the case. Madeline Gold had a great study in JAMA that showed that assessing suicide risk in teens and adolescents did not increase suicide risk. And that's been shown in a couple different populations. I think it was Philip Smith who was first author. Kelly Sakrawitz's group also did a study looking at suicide research, again showing that assessing suicide, asking about suicide, does not increase suicide risk. So, don't be afraid to ask of suicide. The other thing is that sometimes people are afraid of how someone will respond. Will someone be mad at me? Will they, what will they think if I ask them about suicide? What I have found in my own clinical work, just anecdotally, is people who are not suicidal when asked about suicide usually are just very clear that it doesn't apply to them. They're like, oh, no, not me. I would never think of that. They don't take offense to it. They just are very clear that it's not applicable to them. Much like if you don't do drugs and your physician asks you, do you use illegal substances? You're like, no. You don't feel angry that they asked you, that he or she asked you. It's more that you just make it clear that that doesn't apply to you. And I think suicide's the same way. I've never had it where someone gets upset with me for assessing for suicide, but I just put that out there in case it's helpful. Now, how should and shouldn't you do it? Well, the very first time I assessed suicide, I must admit I did it the wrong way, which is thankfully I was with another graduate student who helped me with this, but it was one of my first clients, and I was very nervous about it, and I knew I had to ask about suicide, and I was very nervous about the answer I was trying to get. So I said, now, you're not thinking about suicide, are you? And by doing that, I made it very clear what the answer was. The answer was to be no. I wanted to hear a no. And that's not helpful because you're not going to get an honest answer from your participant, from your volunteer, from your caller, if you asked in that way. Instead, I found the best way to do this is to be direct, but do so in an open way. So I may ask, it sounds like you're dealing with a lot, and sometimes when people deal with a lot, they'll have some thoughts of harming themselves or suicide. Have you had any of those thoughts? Has that crossed your mind? So asking in a way that you're open to whatever they have to tell you, whether it's yes or no, so that hopefully you don't miss a chance to intervene with someone. So if you have someone who endorses suicidal ideation, the next step is asking about a plan. So have you thought about a way that you may attempt to die by suicide? Do you have access to whatever it is that you are planning on using to die by suicide? And then just within this, you may want to ask yourself, are the plan means likely to be fatal? Because that's something that is worth considering. If someone is planning on using a firearm and they have a firearm, that's pretty serious, and that should be treated, anytime suicide should be treated seriously, but that should be treated more significantly than less lethal means. And then asking is risk imminent. So the way that I've seen this done most successfully is by asking, does this have to be done now? Is there some reason that this needs to be done today or needs to be done urgently? Is there some reason why this can't wait? All those are ways to get to, is the risk imminent? Is this something that you feel like you can't control and you need to act upon now? And if so, then obviously we need to respond to that clinically in a way that's appropriate. And then assessing suicide intent kind of fits with what I was saying before. You can do this by asking about how badly a person desires to die. And again, I often do this by asking about that urgency. Why must this be done now? Why can't it wait? And all that can help you get at suicide intent. And all suicide intent is again, just how badly you want to die by suicide. How serious are you in wanting to make an attempt? So the next step is looking at suicide risk factors. And I'm just going to cover a couple of these just so you have some ideas on what things to look for. So previous suicide attempts, that would be a baseline risk factor. Acute alcohol use, acute loss or separation, those would both be acute risk factors. So those are stressors that may put someone over that threshold we talked about. People may do indirect things or say indirect things that could be signs, saying goodbye to family or friends, giving away belongings, especially valued possessions, acquiring things that may be used for suicide. All these are things to watch out for. Feeling hopeless certainly is a risk factor. We talked some about demographics. Reasons for living. Very strong risk factor is not having reasons for living. A paper I was on with Courtney Baggy and Dorian Lamis and a couple other people looked at this, actually found that having a lack of reasons for living explain the relation between hopelessness and suicidal thoughts. So reasons for living, very, very important. If someone doesn't have any reasons for living, that's a dangerous place to be. Also with this, it's sometimes helpful to ask about religious prohibition against suicide. Are you a member of a religion that, how does your religion view suicide? What do you think happens to those who die by suicide? Those things also factor into your risk assessment. Does the person live at home? Were they recently released from a hospitalization? One of the highest risks, if not the highest risk for suicide, is shortly after someone's released from the hospital, from an inpatient psychiatric stay. So we really want to watch people during that time. Unemployment, again, that's a stressor that can affect whether or not someone's suicidal. Rigid black or white thinking. I think it's important because the way I kind of conceptualize suicide is it's maladaptive problem solving. It's trying to solve a problem that often is temporary with a permanent solution. So often you'll have very concrete black and white thinking where someone views it, either I do this or I can't fix the problem, when often it's not that simple. Impulsivity is, the literature is mixed, honestly. Hopefully there'll soon be a review coming out in the near future that helps clear it up. But right now, it just depends on which study, but there's certainly some evidence that impulsivity can increase suicide risk. Agitation is a really good predictor of acute risk. So if someone's agitated, you typically see this agitation right before suicide attempts. So that's something really to look for. Stressful events, of course, goes back to the stressors. And then lack of belongingness and burdensomeness, again, going into the Joyner model, and then acquired capability, acquired capacity, also fits with Joyner model. So I want to introduce you to a measure that I really like that hasn't gotten as much attention as I really think it deserves. So this is the Suicidal Adult Assessment Profile, or the SAP, and it assesses many aspects of suicidal thinking, including both chronic and acute risk factors. And it also looks at both risk and protective factors, so it's a really nice comprehensive assessment tool. The reason I really love this is that each risk factor is weighted based upon odds ratios in the literature. So let me explain what these are. So an odds ratio is a way of looking at how much greater risk someone is at given a certain risk factor. So an odds ratio of 1 means that you're at no greater risk than someone without that risk factor. An odds ratio of 2 means that you're at twice the risk as someone without that risk factor. So all these are just ways of looking at how much greater risk does each risk factor put you at. So low risk is anywhere between 1 and 2.9 times greater risk. Medium is between 3 and 4.9 times greater risk, and so on. So this is what the SAP looks like. So you'll see for each risk factor, you can do either low, medium, high, or extreme. And if it's grayed out here, that means you don't use it. So that way you can see that you're weighting, for instance, at just one diagnosis, more so than you're weighting gender. And this is again informed by the literature. So it's a great measure to use because it is informed by the literature. Sorry this got cut off. But it's informed by the literature. It was written by a forensic psychologist, so it's really written and thought of with legal issues and the law in mind. So if you get called in, into a courtroom, what's the best assessment that you can have behind you? And it's designed to be a really strong assessment for that. It also accounts for many aspects of suicidality. And just a couple cons to mention. Again, it hasn't caught on as much as I'd really like it to, or as much as I think it should. So there hasn't been a whole lot of validation work on it. Hopefully in the future there'll be more. And there aren't cutoffs. You still have to use your clinical judgment, but it's a really good guide for that clinical judgment. So for trying to look at, making sure you don't miss any significant risk factors, and also for weighting each one appropriately. I also thought about, what are some tips that I'd give someone working on a crisis line for talking with suicidal clients, and I came up with a couple based upon the literature and based upon suicide treatments. The first one, based off of CAMS, the treatment CAMS, is keep the conversation collaborative, being aware that sometimes you and the person you're talking to may not have congruent goals. You may have someone that you're talking to that really does want to die by suicide, and you want to keep them here. So try to make it collaborative. Try to find a way that you're both working toward the same thing. They have a problem. You want to help them solve that problem, hopefully in a way that's not using a permanent solution, or at least a permanently negative final solution. So you're on the same team, so make sure they realize you're on the same team and work on the same team, because otherwise sometimes you can get pushback and have it become you versus them, which is not going to be productive. Also, as I mentioned, suicidal individuals are often struggling with problem solving, and they may feel like suicide's the only solution. They often may feel very ambivalent about living, so they don't care if they live or die. It's either way. So just be aware of that there's this inner struggle over, should I die? Should I live? Feeling all the pressures of having a problem and seeing no other solution. So how you can be helpful is just helping them kind of process that, kind of go through what they're experiencing and talk about ways that, other solutions that may be there, or maybe even just giving them hope. Absolutely giving them hope. Hope that there may be other solutions that they're not considering. Just trying to get them into treatment so then they can at least explore this before, again, making a final decision, before, taking that final solution that's not a good solution, that, eliminates any potential for solving the problem. And then be aware of your own countertransference. So what this is it's essentially your feelings toward the caller. There are going to be times that you're working with someone that, you may not particularly like. Maybe it's someone that's calling right at the end of your shift. You've had a long day. You have to try to be aware of those feelings you have and not let them affect your relationship with that caller. Because you don't want any feelings you have, you don't want to have that affect your work with the individual. And lastly, I wanted to talk about safety plans. This is what many clinicians, really I would argue all clinicians should do with someone who's suicidal. But I think aspects of this may be applicable to crisis lines. So I wanted to at least make you aware of it so you could consider using aspects of it, or at least know what clinicians are using in the field. So it's long been recognized that no suicide contracts are not effective. So having someone sign a contract that says that they will not die by suicide doesn't work. But what does work is setting up a plan to try to help someone be ready and be prepared for dealing with suicidal thoughts and dealing with needing to manage these thoughts and urges. So the first step of this is recognizing the warning signs. So what are the triggers? What are the things that lead to this individual developing a crisis? Once these are identified, then it's easier to try to figure out when the person may need more support or need more help. The second thing you do is once you know what is going to lead you to be in a crisis, developing a coping strategy and using it. So this can be doing pleasant things, especially if they involve doing things in public with other people, as we'll talk about next. Not using alcohol or drugs. We don't want to just mask what the person's experiencing, but doing things that will hopefully make them feel better and cope in a more positive way. Socialize with others or people who are either with other people or just being in places with other people can be very helpful. Again, going back to Joiner's interpersonal psychological theory of suicide, we know that loneliness, that feeling of lack of belongingness, can be associated with the desire for suicide. So it's good to be around other people, interacting with other people. It can be very, very helpful for overcoming the suicidal thoughts and urges. The next step is talk to family members or friends. So if you're not feeling better on your own doing these things, talk to someone you trust about the thoughts you're having. Get some help. Get support from your family, from friends. Don't do it alone. So talking to others who can help. Another step after that would be contact a mental health professional or contact the Suicide Lifeline. Get in touch with people that can help provide that support, which we all need at different times. It's, none of us can go through all this alone. We need support as we go. So getting in touch with a mental health professional or the Lifeline to help give you that support and to help you solve some of the problems that may seem like they can't be overcome on your own. And then lastly, ensure your environment is safe. So if you can't, if you're feeling like you can't control your urges, go to the ER, call 911, do whatever you need to stay safe. Get access to suicidal means out of your house. Get rid of guns. Do things like that so that you are able to stay safe and you don't have these, potential risk factors right around you. All these things can help you get through that acute phase because, as we mentioned, going back to Rudd's theory, the acute phase may be a couple hours, it may be a couple days, but it's not something that people just stay in. People, go to that acute phase, but then they come back down. It's about surviving those phases. So you don't want to have, for instance, guns in your house, especially if that's the method you would use, because it's so easy to turn to that method instead of just trying to work through that acute phase and getting past it. So with that, I want to leave with one thought is there's hope out there. If you're feeling suicidal, there's hope. There's a lot to live for, and it may not feel like it. And you may not know where to turn. But recovery happens. I've seen it many times. People get better, but you have to keep with it. You have to still be here in order to get help. So call the hotline, 1-800-273-HELP. Or TALK, I'm sorry. 1-800-273-TALK. Let me double check it over my shoulder. Call the hotline if you need to talk to someone. Reach out to friends and family. Talk to people. Don't make a decision like this on your own. It's far too major, because so often, as a problem seems like it can't be solved when it really can, and sometimes we just can't see it on our own. And for those who worked with a suicide hotline or are considering it, I really recommend that you do. It's a great experience. You can help a lot of people. And just be open and listen to people as they call in, and just help them find their hope. Help them find even the hope that, maybe tomorrow will be better. Just survive it for one more day, 2 more days. Because again, we know that the suicide risk is often just temporary. It comes and goes. We just need to help individuals at risk of suicide survive from one day to the next. So I hope this has been helpful to you. I'll put the information for the suicide hotline in the description for this video, so it's there if you need it. And I hope you have a wonderful day.